The Republic was so afraid of Canudos that killing the city was not enough. It dug up the dead preacher, cut off his head, and asked science to prove the poor were insane. The government needed Canudos to be insane so the massacre could feel justified. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Imagine a city made of mud, prayer, hunger, and stubborn hope, rising in the dry backlands of Brazil like a candle in a graveyard. Now imagine the new republic looking at that city and seeing not poverty, not faith, not abandoned people trying to survive, but a monster, a monarchist nest, a sickness, a rebellion. That was Canudos, also called Belo Monte, the beautiful mountain. And the question still burns. Why did Brazil decide this city had to disappear? The official story was simple enough to fit inside a rifle barrel. A crazed preacher had hypnotized poor backlanders. His followers were fanatics. They hated the republic. They wanted the monarchy restored. They threatened civilization itself. But wait, notice what that story does. It turns hungry families into a plague. It turns shelter into sedition. It turns a mud city into a national enemy. And once a people are called a sickness, there is always someone ready to prescribe fire. The real story begins far from the coast, in the northeastern backlands of Bahia, where thorn bushes scratch the earth, rivers vanish by season, and hunger can travel faster than a horse. In 1893, on the site of an abandoned cattle ranch beside the Vazabaras River, a settlement began to grow around a wandering lay preacher named Antonio Vicente Mendes Maciel, remembered in history as Antônio Conselheiro, Antonio the Counselor. He did not arrive with an army. He arrived with prayers, tools, and followers. Most records place Antonio's birth in 1830, though some sources give 1828. That small uncertainty already tells us something. The man who would terrify the Republic did not begin as a thunderbolt in the archive. He began as a boy in Santo Antonio de Quixeramobim in Ceará, born into a family respectable enough to own property, but wounded by debt, violence, alcoholism, and an old clan feud that had already soaked his family name in blood. As a child, Antonio was not the wild prophet later newspapers wanted him to be. He studied Portuguese, French, and Latin. He spent long hours indoors, pale from the shadow, working for his father. Some of his schoolmates would become police chiefs, lawyers, journalists, men whose signatures could open doors. Antonio inherited a different road. His mother died when he was young. His father died when Antonio was a grown man, leaving debts, sisters to support, and a life already leaning toward collapse. He tried to live inside the ordinary world. He took over business affairs. He married his cousin, Brasiliana. He taught, worked as a clerk, opened small stores and failed. He tried legal petition work, the kind of work done by men close enough to the law to smell its ink, but not powerful enough to own its doors. Then came the wound the legends never forgot. His wife left him for a militia sergeant. After that, something in Antonio began walking away. By the early 1870s, he reappeared in the backlands transformed. Thin, severe, dressed in a rough blue tunic, wearing worn sandals, carrying a wooden staff. He walked through Ceará, Bahia, Pernambuco, and Sergipe. He asked permission to repair cemetery walls, rebuild chapels, restore churches, and later help build reservoirs. This mattered. In a place where the living were abandoned, even the dead sometimes rested behind broken walls. To repair a cemetery was not decoration, it was mercy. People followed him because he gave shape to their suffering. He did not claim to be a priest. He did not perform sacraments. He did not call himself a saint. He preached outdoors in public squares and open air, often beginning with Latin words that made the dust feel older. Many did not understand the language, but they understood the weight. They heard discipline, repentance, work, salvation, and a warning. The world was changing, and not for the poor. To the coastal elite, this was already suspicious, but in the backlands, wandering holy men were not strange. Rural Catholic life had long been filled with lay devotees, pilgrims, counselors, and church builders, especially where priests were few and official religion arrived late, if at all. Antonio followed a known path. What made him dangerous was not that he preached. It was that people listened. And the people who listened were the very people landowners, police, politicians, and bishops expected to remain scattered. The backlands had been prepared for a man like this by disaster. Between 1877 and 1880, the Great Drought tore through the Northeast. Refugees fled toward the coast, toward the forests, toward any rumor of water or work. The disease killed tens of thousands in Fortaleza. Families scattered, children vanished into the roads, hunger became a geography. Later, hundreds of thousands would flee toward the Amazon. Pulled by rubber and pushed by despair, the land kept receipts, and every receipt was written on a body. So when Antonio spoke against cruelty, against slavery, against the arrogance of police, against debt, luxury, and moral decay, people heard more than religion. They heard a diagnosis. He was harsh. He could be rigid. He feared the new secular order. He thundered against civil marriage, against state control of religious life, against a republic that seemed to reach into birth, death, marriage, labor, taxes, and the soul. To city men, this was backwardness. To backlanders, it was survival speaking. The republic itself was young and nervous. The monarchy had fallen in 1889. A new constitution came in 1891. Church and state were formally separated. Civil marriage became law. State records began replacing church authority in intimate matters. To educated men on the coast, this was progress. To many rural Catholics, it felt like strangers entering the family altar. The old Emperor Pedro II, imagined by some as a distant father figure, was gone. In his place came forms, taxes, uniforms, and suspicion. This is where Canudos begins to breathe. In 1893, Antonio and his followers settled at the abandoned ranch of Canudos, and he called the place Belo Monte, the beautiful mountain. There were already mud houses nearby and a ruined manor house. The river ran only by season, but it ran. The surrounding land could support planting, goats, horses, and cattle. That detail matters. Antonio did not choose the site because it was a perfect fortress. He chose it because people could live there. Before Belo Monte became a city, there was a spark at Bom Conselheiro. The story remembers an old woman in the market trying to sell a straw mat when a fee collector demanded more than the mat was worth. That evening, Antonio spoke of her humiliation and accused the Republic of dragging the poor back toward slavery. Soon, tax notices burned in the square. It was not a revolution, not yet. But it gave his enemies the smoke they needed. A small police force was sent after him and his followers near Macete. The officials expected penitence. They found armed protectors. Shots were fired, men died, and Antonio kept moving north toward a valley where wounded people could build behind mud walls and prayer. Still, from above, the place looked like a trap waiting to be misunderstood. Hills and low mountains circled the valley. One height, later remembered as Favela Hill, watched over the approaches. Trails twisted through thorn and dust. Outsiders saw desolation. Locals saw routes, hiding places, water signs, animal paths, every bend and fold of ground. The backlands were not empty to those who knew them. The backlands was a book. The army would arrive later and discover it could not read. The settlement grew with frightening speed. Some accounts say that by 1896 it had become one of the largest urban concentrations in Bahia, after Salvador, the coastal capital hundreds of kilometers away. The exact number is uncertain. The wilder rumors spoke of 25,000 or 30,000 people. A more careful estimate is closer to 15,000 or 20,000, but even that was enormous for the region. A ranch had become a city, and the city was made of people who were not supposed to gather. Picture it, not marble, not fountains, not the shining architecture of a capital trying to impress Europe. A city of mud brick homes, many with clay roofs, some painted gray, some red, spreading below the hills. A main street cut through the settlement. Narrow lanes wandered away from it. Two churches faced a central square. There were warehouses, armories, cemeteries, cisterns, a barracks, a schoolhouse, and basements dug beneath houses and church walls. From hunger and hands, a world had risen. And it was not a world of ghosts. It traded. It stored food. It raised animals. It planted manioc and beans. Pack drivers came and went. Merchants moved goods through the region. Weapons, cattle, hides, wood, salt, food, cloth, rumors, all crossed those trails. Canudos was not the sealed-off nightmare later propaganda described. It was connected, organized, and alive. The Republic called it irrational, but no starving mob builds a city that lasts for years without knowing how to think. Antonio did not run everything alone. This is another detail the old myth tries to hide. Belo Monte had organization. João Abade, called the people's chief, commanded the Catholic Guard and kept order in the streets. Antonio Villanova, a wealthy merchant, controlled much of the local economy. His handwritten notes worked like money inside the settlement. He dressed in a suit and tie, lived near the churches, and watched commerce move through the holy city. Even mud has its hierarchies. That is why the truth is more interesting than the caricature. Canudos was not paradise. It had merchants, discipline, favoritism, fear, punishment, armed men, and religious severity. A merchant suspected of betrayal was killed and his property was looted. Some people came from devotion. Some came because they had nowhere else. Some came with families. Some brought livestock, jewelry, or trade connections. The city was not innocent in the simple way legends like to portray it. It was human, and that is harder to dismiss. Its people were not one kind of people. They were peasants of mixed African, indigenous, and European ancestry. They were freed people and descendants of fugitive slaves. There were indigenous and mixed indigenous families, including people of Kariri origin. There were townspeople, merchants, women from respected families, old people, children, and men already marked by violence. Outsiders flattened them into one word: armed backlands fighters. After Canudos, that word would darken into outlaw. First power names you, then it loads the name with fear. The presence of freed people and their descendants matters deeply. Antonio had spoken against slavery before the abolition in 1888. He condemned it as an abomination. Families connected to older fugitive communities were drawn to Belo Monte. In Canudos, they found no luxury. They found distance from old masters, police, hunger, and humiliation. Yet later, memory rarely celebrated Antonio as a voice against slavery. It was easier to remember him as mad than to admit that the madman had defended the enslaved. Women carried Belo Monte too, though the record often sees them through hostile eyes. Antonio kept a distance from women and imposed strict moral rules. He banned prostitution, tried to restrict cane liquor, and punished public flirtation. Yet women farmed, cooked, carried water, hauled stone, moved salt from distant quarries, cared for children, nursed the wounded, and in some cases fought. One woman, Maria da Guerra de Jesus, had served as a nurse and in the final days killed a soldier with a sickle. There was Aunt Benta, a midwife and practical woman from Itapicuru, who had owned property before following Antonio to Canudos. She cooked for him and cared for his austere home. Her fate disappears into the smoke. That is another cruelty of this history. Generals leave dispatches, presidents leave decrees, journalists leave books, but the women who kept the city alive often leave only a name, a task, a rumor, and the shadow of a hand over a cooking fire. Children went to school in Canudos, boys and girls together. Let that sit there for a moment. In a region where public education barely touched the rural poor, this so-called nest of madness had classrooms. Teachers came from nearby towns. One was Maria Francisca de Vasconcelos, a trained young woman who had fled family restrictions on her marriage and found in Belo Monte a different kind of possibility. Not everyone in Canudos was a devotee. Some came because the outside world had already refused them. But a city like this does not grow without enemies. Local rural bosses watched labor leave their estates. Workers who once depended on landlords, wages, credit, and protection were now moving into a settlement ruled by a preacher and his aides. Votes were leaving too. The early republic depended on rural bosses controlling the poor, gathering their votes like cattle under a halter, and delivering them upward in exchange for power. Canudos loosened that rope. And when ropes loosen, the hand that holds them panics. The church hierarchy was alarmed as well. Many local priests tolerated Antonio, and some even welcomed his repairs to church property. But bishops were under pressure to bring rural religion under tighter control. Lay preaching, popular devotion, and independent holy men all made the official church uneasy. In May of 1895, the Archbishop of Salvador sent a delegation to Canudos, led by an Italian Capuchin missionary, to bring the settlement back under church authority. The visit was doomed from the start. The missionaries crossed into Belo Monte and saw armed men, crowded streets, coffins being carried toward the cemetery, and people living in poverty, which shocked them. Antonio greeted them politely and showed them the church work. But the lead missionary spoke with the hard voice of authority. He condemned the armed followers, the overcrowding, and the misery, and told the people they should disperse and return home. Imagine telling refugees to go back to the hunger they had escaped and calling it salvation. The mission lasted only days. Masses were offered. Baptisms were performed. Marriages were regularized. Confessions were heard. But trust did not grow. When the priest objected to the armed men, Antonio answered that the police had attacked him before at Masete. In the days of the monarchy, he said, he had submitted because he recognized that government. The republic he did not recognize. Those words traveled farther than he may have intended. In frightened ears, they sounded like treason. After the mission, the church report called Canudos a political religious sect and a source of resistance to the constituted government. The report described poor sanitation, overcrowding, disrespect for authority, and alarming independence. Yet even that hostile account did not prove the wildest rumors. It did not show Antonio claiming priestly power. It did not show a secret monarchist army. It showed a city outside official control. And for the powerful, that was already close enough to rebellion. Then came the wood. History sometimes hides a massacre inside an object small enough to carry. Antonio was building a new church, and timber had been ordered and paid for, and was being shipped toward Juazeiro on the São Francisco River. The wood arrived, but it was not released. Antonio sent representatives to intercede. Rumor inflated this into a plan to invade and loot the city. A merchant appealed for protection. Political enemies smelled opportunity. Suddenly, timber for a church became proof of war. Late in 1896, a state police force marched to intercept the group from Canudos. Later witnesses would claim the procession was carrying rosaries carved from coconut husks, religious banners, and a large wooden cross, and that the police fired first near Wawa. The exact memory is tangled in war, but the result is not. The backlanders fought with old rifles, knives, farm tools, tree limbs, iron bars, and cattle prods. Many of them died. Several soldiers died too. The troops withdrew. For the state government, retreat was humiliation. For the young republic, humiliation became evidence. If Canudos could beat soldiers, then Canudos must be more than a settlement. It must be a conspiracy. Newspapers and politicians began feeding the nation a fever dream. Weapons were supposedly coming from Argentina. Foreign soldiers were supposedly arriving from the United States or Austria to restore the monarchy. It was nonsense, but useful nonsense. A poor city defending itself is uncomfortable. A foreign-backed enemy is easier to kill. Now the war began to widen. The first expedition had been turned back at Wawa. The second came larger, under Major Fabronio de Brito, and still returned broken. Then came the third, led by Colonel Moreira Cesar, a famous Republican officer carrying the fury of a government tired of embarrassment. He brought more troops, artillery, cavalry, and millions of rounds of ammunition. But the backlands swallowed confidence. Moreira Cesar was killed in the fighting, and the shock rolled across Brazil like thunder. His death changed everything. Now Canudos was no longer just a religious settlement in a distant valley. It was a wound to national pride. The Republic had promised order, progress, modernity, and control. Yet here was a mud city humiliating officers, absorbing bullets, and refusing to kneel. The more Canudos survived, the more monstrous it became in the imagination of those who needed it defeated. A poor man with a prayer is tolerable. A poor man who defeats artillery becomes unnatural. This is where the famous writer Euclides da Cunha enters the story. He came as a war correspondent and later wrote the monumental account that shaped how generations remembered Canudos. He saw courage, he saw suffering, he was horrified by what was done, but he also carried the racial theories and coastal arrogance of his time. He called Canudos Brazil's Vendée, comparing it to a counter-revolutionary uprising from France. It was a brilliant phrase and also a dangerous one. That phrase made the Republic comfortable. If Canudos was a Brazilian Vendée, then the mud city was not a social wound, it was a political tumor. But the comparison was too clean for a dirty truth. Antonio was not leading a grand restoration of the monarchy. He opposed the secular republic because it threatened the religious and moral world his followers understood. He feared civil marriage, state records, taxes, Masons, Protestants, and the invasion of official power into sacred life. That is not the same as a royalist master plan. The fourth expedition came with the weight of the whole country. Beginning in June of 1897, the army poured into the backlands with Krupp field cannon, machine guns, thousands of soldiers, and the determination not to be embarrassed again. General Arthur Oscar de Andrade Guimarães commanded the final push. The Minister of War watched. The nation followed by the telegraph. Each report turned the valley into a theater. Every failure fed rage. Every rumor demanded revenge. Belo Monte was now marked for annihilation. But the army that marched in the name of civilization was not a clean machine. Many soldiers were poor men themselves, peasants pressed into uniform, underfed, unpaid, badly equipped, and terrified. Some were boys barely in their teens. The heat climbed mercilessly. Dust covered their faces, rifles, wounds, and food. Water was scarce and foul. Disease moved through camps like another battalion. The Republic sent the poor to kill the poor and called the March Progress. Monte Santo became a staging ground of misery. Prices soared. Eggs and cheese turned into luxuries. Wounded soldiers lay near the diseased. Medical students came because there were too few physicians. Women followed the columns as cooks, washers, companions, nurses, and survivors of their own private wars. One woman from the far south stayed after her soldier companion died, worked as a hospital aide, caught smallpox, and died too. Even the victors were being eaten by the campaign. Inside Canudos, the defenders knew the land the way a body knows pain. Outsiders saw thorn and dust. The backlanders saw trails, hollows, blind turns, shadows, stones, water memories. They fired from cover, vanished, returned, raided supplies, and slipped through lines when others would have found only death. The army called them primitive, but primitive men do not outmaneuver trained forces for months without intelligence. They were not fighting outside history. They were fighting inside a landscape that remembered them, and Canudos continued to function longer than outsiders expected. Cattle were slaughtered, food was stored, weapons and ammunition kept appearing through trade, raids, allies, and battlefield capture. This was not magic, it was logistics, mud logistics, backlands logistics, carried by mule, memory, merchants, and desperation. Antonio Villanova and other traders mattered as much as the gunmen. A holy city still needs supply lines. A prophecy still needs beans. That is the part that the propaganda never knew how to explain. Antonio himself was fading. He was nearly 70, sick, exhausted by years of walking, fasting, preaching, sleeping on floors, and carrying apocalypse in his voice. He withdrew more and more as the siege tightened. On September 22nd, 1897, he died of dysentery, about 2 weeks before the city fell. His followers kept fighting. The man was gone, but Belo Monte had become more than a man. It was now a vow made of walls, hunger, and grief. Then, near the end, the camera came. Not as a neutral witness, not as a friend. The photographer, Flávio de Barros, came with the army and left some of the only photographic traces of the conflict. Officers posed. Ruins were framed. Prisoners were recorded. The body of Antônio Conselheiro was made visible to the victorious world. The poor had been ignored while alive. At the moment of their destruction, the Republic suddenly wanted their image. The camera became another weapon of memory. Think about that. For years, Canudos had been a rumor, a nest, a plague, a fanatic city, a threat in the wilderness. Then the camera arrived, and the army could decide what the nation saw. It did not photograph the first hunger that drove families there. It did not photograph the broken cemeteries Antonio rebuilt. It did not photograph every mother who carried stones for a church. It photographed defeat. History often does this. It arrives late, then pretends to have seen everything. The final days were hunger, thirst, smoke, and refusal. Women outnumbered men. Some men had escaped through trails still open before the circle tightened, leaving wives and children behind. Others stayed. Children moved through ruins. The wounded waited without medicine. Houses became barricades. Churches became landmarks in a battlefield. Each mud wall taken by the army meant another few steps, another body, another blast, another scream. Canudos was not conquered like a city. It was cut apart like a living thing. On October 5th, 1897, Canudos fell toward dusk. Euclides da Cunha later gave the ending its most famous image, the last defenders reduced to an old man, 2 grown men, and a child facing thousands of soldiers. Whether every detail of that image can be weighed like a stone is less important than what it reveals. Brazil wanted Canudos to be both savage and heroic, both a shame and a proof, both a monster and a martyr. Even the ending could not stay simple. After the fall, the destruction was deliberate. More than 5,000 houses were burned or torn down. Prisoners were killed. Some had their throats slit in camps near Canudos and Queimadas. Wounded survivors were abused. Children were murdered. Women and girls were taken, beaten, raped, forced into service or concubinage. The victorious army did not simply defeat Belo Monte. It tried to erase the possibility that such a place had ever truly belonged to human beings. Then they dug up Antônio Conselheiro. His body was exhumed. His head was cut off and taken away. It was displayed before coastal crowds with a joy that should make any honest nation lower its eyes. Doctors examined the skull, searching for signs of madness, degeneration, proof that the old theories were right and the backlands had produced a biological monster. But the skull refused to confess. Bone did not give them the answer they wanted. One physician, Raimundo Nina Rodrigues, wrote about an epidemic of insanity at Canudos. He placed Antonio and his followers inside the racial science of the time, seeing mixed ancestry, poverty, religion, and violence as symptoms of degeneration. Yet even he noticed something inconvenient. The physical evidence did not show the expected mark of biological monstrosity. The theories were hungry, but the dead man's head gave them no meat. So the story leaned harder on words: fanatic, savage, primitive, outlaw. And still, not everyone accepted the lie. Some condemned the killing of prisoners. Some asked what kind of republic needed to cut the throats of defeated people. In Salvador, a citizens' committee formed to aid survivors, especially women and children. Collection boxes appeared in streets. Journalists, clergy, physicians, and civic workers traveled toward the war zone with medicine, burial work, and a difficult mission: to rescue survivors before they vanished into orphanages, factories, private houses, or worse. The committee's records preserve another Canudos, one that the war reports tried to flatten. Among the survivors were women and children of many backgrounds. Some were described as white, even blonde, even from good families. Others were mixed race, orphaned, wounded, silent, intelligent, terrified. There were children from the Canudos school, girls harmed by soldiers. Women who wanted to return to the inland. These were not symbols. They had parents, livestock, scars, memories, and names. That is why the massacre cannot be hidden inside theory. Many residents had escaped before the final destruction. Some male survivors were not executed. More than 100 women and children were taken to Salvador and, in some cases, reunited with relatives or placed under care. This does not soften the horror. It makes it more real. Total legends are easy to mourn. Partial survival is messier. It leaves witnesses, it leaves descendants, it leaves paperwork, it leaves voices that refuse to let the ashes settle into silence. And then there is the word that still echoes through Brazil: favela. Near Canudos stood Favela Hill, named for a thorny plant of the region. After the war, some soldiers who had fought in the campaign later occupied a hill in Rio de Janeiro, and the name followed them. Over time, that name became tied to informal settlements across Brazil. Even the word favela carries a ghost of Canudos. A destroyed backland city left its thorn inside the language of the modern city. So why did Canudos frighten Brazil so much? Not because Antonio was all-powerful, not because Belo Monte was a secret capital of monarchists, not because the poor had discovered some military miracle. Canudos terrified the republic because it exposed the fragility under the flag. Brazil wanted to see itself as modern, harmonious, and advancing toward civilization. But beneath that proud mirror stood a mostly illiterate, mostly poor, deeply unequal population, watched by police, trapped by bosses, and ignored until it moved. The settlement threatened the rural labor system by prompting workers to leave the estates. It threatened local politics because voters lost control of the bosses. It threatened the church hierarchy because religious life flourished outside official supervision. It threatened the republic because it refused to recognize the new order. And it threatened the national imagination because it proved that abandoned people could build something together without permission. That was the deepest danger. Not that Belo Monte was lawless, but that it had its own law. There is no need to make Antônio Conselheiro a flawless saint. He was severe. He could be controlling. His moral rules were harsh, especially toward women. He feared parts of modern life that many today would not fear. His followers included armed men with violent pasts. Belo Monte had hierarchy, punishment, and internal injustice. But there is also no need to accept the demon mask. Antonio did not invent the misery of the backlands. He gathered people already wounded by it. The old official story needed him mad because madness is convenient. Madness explains away hunger. Madness explains away drought. Madness explains away abolition's unfinished promises. Madness explains away police brutality, land hunger, racial contempt, abandoned education, and the terror of rural elites losing control. Call the preacher insane, and the city becomes a symptom. Call the people fanatics, and their suffering becomes their fault. That is why we have to be careful with the words history leaves in our mouths. The faith of Canudos was not strange to those who lived it. Saints were not distant statues. They were companions in the house. Promises to holy figures shaped journeys, offerings, pilgrimages, and survival. Suffering could be punishment, yes, but also a test. Prayer was not an escape from reality. Prayer was a tool inside reality, like a knife, a water gourd, or a seed. To outsiders, this looked like superstition. To the poor, it was a map through disaster. Some older echoes surrounded the movement too, especially the hope that sacred kings or divine justice might return and overturn the world's cruelty. But Canudos cannot be reduced to waiting for miracles. Its people built houses, they planted beans, they raised goats, they buried the dead, they educated children. They guarded roads. They argued, traded, cooked, prayed, and feared. A city that waits only for heaven does not manage warehouses. Belo Monte was mystical, yes, but it was also practical. That is what makes the story so haunting. The Republic said it was defending civilization from barbarism, yet in Belo Monte there was a schoolhouse, commerce, churches, reservoirs, labor, ritual, and refuge. The army arrived with cannon, telegraph, doctors, reporters, and flags, and then cut prisoners' throats. Which side was civilization? Which side was barbarism? The answer is not as clean as the textbooks once wanted, and maybe that is why Canudos still refuses to stay buried. The mud returns again and again. Mud houses, mud streets, mud walls, mud graves. The Republic had paper, uniforms, decrees, rifles, theories, and photographers. Canudos had mud, wood, rosaries, cattle, and memory. But mud is not weakness. Mud holds footprints. Mud remembers rain. Mud becomes brick when hands press it into shape. For almost 4 years, in a place the powerful dismissed as backward, the poor pressed a city into being. That was the miracle the Republic could not forgive. Euclides da Cunha saw enough to be haunted, and his account haunted Brazil in return. He preserved the tragedy, but also trapped it inside the language of his age. Coast against backlands, progress against archaic life, science against faith, whitened modernity against mixed-race survival. Later writers kept returning to Canudos, bending it toward their own meanings. Some made Antonio a madman, some made him a socialist hero, some made the backlanders noble primitives. Few allowed them to remain fully human, and maybe that is the most respectful thing we can offer them now, to acknowledge the complication. Canudos was not a conspiracy, it was not a simple rebellion, it was not a paradise, it was not a nest of devils. It was a holy refuge, a political threat, a labor crisis, a religious challenge, a survival strategy, and finally a battlefield. It was built by people the nation had ignored until their gathering became louder than their silence. Then the nation heard them through cannon smoke. The tragedy is that Belo Monte asked for space and received annihilation. Its people wanted to live under rules they believed would protect their souls from a world turning hostile and strange. But their withdrawal exposed how much the outside world depended on them staying available, obedient, countable, taxable, employable, and afraid. The poor are often tolerated when they suffer in place. They become dangerous when they move together and decide that misery is not their natural address. So return to the opening image. A city made of mud, prayer, hunger, and stubborn hope, glowing in the dry backlands like a candle in a graveyard. Was the Republic afraid of Antônio Conselheiro's prophecies? Maybe. Was it afraid of monarchist rumors? Certainly, but perhaps the deeper fear was simpler. Canudos proved that abandoned people could organize a world without permission, and for those who rule by making permission sacred, that is the most terrifying miracle of all. Today, the ruins do not speak in one voice. They ask us to listen carefully to the soldier dying of thirst, to the woman carrying a stone, to the child in the schoolhouse, to the freed family seeking a place beyond slavery's shadow, to the preacher in the blue tunic, to the camera that arrived too late, to the Republic that called itself modern while cutting off a dead man's head. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.